Good morning, everyone. I'm Victor Horton from Maine Resource Recovery and the FRC, Food Recovery Council. I was going to tell you that this is brought to you by the letter F, the letter R, and the letter C, but that seemed kind of childish. So, the Food Recovery Council presents the Maine Master Compost Community Composter course. This is number 2 with Mark King for the Maine DEP. He's our ultimate authority on composting and has been doing this type of work for 30 years. Find a teacher you won't find. So just a little quick note again, the FRC, like-minded individuals with the goal of minimizing wasted food. And this course hopefully will help you accomplish that. How to get involved? Reach out to us at the website email address. Ash, I don't think she's still here, but you can't see her. And we look forward to a survey we're going to do to see where we go from here for the Food Recovery Council. Hopefully you'll all be able to take that. I'll just say a couple quick words about this. The DEP is kicking off their solid waste diversion grant program, and some of the things that you can apply for, businesses are allowed, municipalities, associations, and I believe this, if Mark could correct me if I'm wrong, if you ask questions now, you have to do them officially, and there's no more help available for little tidbits until after the grant is ended. Is that correct, Mark?
Yeah, they have to ask questions through the vendor portal, and I have a week before the proposals are due to answer them. But I can't take any phone calls or emails. They have to all be done through the portal.
Right. Trying to keep it as fair as possible for everybody.
Yep.
And I'm not going to read all this, but the certificate for taking this course will demonstrate your technical ability, and it'll help you apply for the permit by rule from the Maine DEP, which should be fairly easy to get, once you get certified, if you decide to go that route. We have the 5 webinar series. Here's the pricing, passing score of 70. And today we're doing feedstocks and recipe. And then the 3rd class in March will be methods and systems. And if any of you miss one of the classes, or if you have to leave early or came in late, we're going to have them at mra.net, and I'll just give you a quick little tour of how you get there. It's pretty simple. And then the 4th, building and managing your compost pile, held at the conference at Samoset. And those that can't attend, we're going to do that one live. And the 5th and final, we're going to have a little field trip where we go and look at some piles, try to find out what's wrong possibly with them. Maybe we'll put some fake wrong stuff, so we'll at least have something to show you, like what to look for. And you can watch these as many times as you like because they're all free. If you don't get certified, you can just watch these every day for the next month if you'd like. And the sticker in the middle here, we're going to be putting this on our lending carts. We're still working on that program to after this, it'll be available. So after these webinar series, you'll be able to borrow for a small fee or whatever we figure out to do your own little program, like a pilot project. And here's just a sticker a little bit bigger, updating the logos shortly. So here's Mark's contact info. Best way to get him, you can even, call us, Ash, me. He's easy to find.
There you go.
So then we have the Maine Foods Too Good to Waste, and I'm going to turn this over to Mark. And then afterwards, remind me, and we'll take a quick look at where you find those videos. So take it away, Mark.
Thanks, sir.
Stop my sharing, and you can start.
Okay. All right, does everybody see this?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay, awesome. So what Vic mentioned, by the way, we were able to obtain, I believe it's 30 55-gallon carts. And what we're offering is for municipalities and other programs that take this class. If they want to start a program in their own community, we'll loan them up to 5, which will all be stickered with the appropriate material to start a program, run it for 6 months. And then if they decide they want to continue on, they're welcome to either purchase those containers or get their own. And we would take them back and just have them to loan to the next community. So I think it's gonna be a great program. I'm looking forward to it. All right, so now without further ado, let's go ahead and So the first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to review what we covered in the last class. And as Vic said, you can access that class. It was recorded and you can watch it as many times as you want before you take the certification exam, which is also free. And then if you pass the certification exam with a 75, you can then decide if you want to get certification through MRRA. The department made it very clear that I could do all of this, but I could not charge anything for my time because I work for the state of Maine. So that's why MRRA is the certifying agent. Anyways, the first thing that we learned is we learned that composting was a biological process which involves many organisms, from what we call macroscopic, the bugs, worms, things you can see with your eye, fungi, down to the actual microorganisms that do the bulk of the work, the thermophilic bacteria, things like that, the actinomycetes. We also learned that there are four major inputs that go into composting. Carbon is the food source that microbes feed on, the energy source. Nitrogen is the compounds that microbes turn into amino acids and proteins, and they use it as building blocks to form more microbes, which is really, really important to the process, because without the right balance of carbon and nitrogen, we wouldn't be able to have an active, thriving pile. We learned that oxygen is super important because as long as the microbes are using oxygen, they don't produce odor, and they work very efficiently. If they start to lose oxygen, then they're prone to producing volatile organic acids, which, as you remember, are very smelly, and they're some of the reasons why compost gets complained about. And then finally, moisture. We need at least a 55% level of moisture because that's where the organisms actually live. And we want it coating all the particles, because if it's not on the particles, the organism can't feed on the particles without being in that suspended solution. We also learned that there are factors that involve the process. So the carbon nitrogen ratio, we want that to be 20 to 30 to 1, because that's the perfect balance to start an optimal pile out. We learned about particle size. If the pile has particles that are too large, air will flow through too quickly and can actually dry the pile out. If the particle size is too small, all the pore spaces that allow the air to flow through can be clogged, and then you have an anaerobic activity, which means odors are being produced and it's not being efficient. We learned that the moisture content needs to be about 55%. We learned how to do it using the squeeze test, where you take a handful of compost, give it a good hard squeeze. If water comes out your knuckles, it's too wet. If you open your hand and it crumbles out, it's too dry. If you open your hand and it forms a wet ball, it's about perfect. And finally, the porosity piece has to do with particle size. You want a mix of coarse and fine particles, so you have structure for the pile, but you have enough airflow space so that it stays aerobic. So porosity and texture are kind of hand in hand. The bigger the particle size, the more porosity you have, but also the less ability to hold on to moisture. Compost benefit-wise, we learned that it is low cost and low tech in most applications. You do have a 40% reduction in initial residual volume, which is really good. You have reduction in odor and leachate potential, and you end up with a stable, odorless soil additive that helps to benefit the soil by either, by adding organic matter, which can hold on to moisture, but also if the soil is really thick and dense, you mix in compost and it kind of opens it up so roots can penetrate. And if the soil is too sandy and excessively well drained, compost actually provides a barrier to hold that moisture in the root zone longer, which can absolutely help during periods of drought when your crops are suffering. If you use compost, most of the crops can withstand a droughting situation. And then finally, the biggest thing we learned is that it's not fertilizer. That's a really important thing.
Morning.
So very good.
I have a class I'm in until 11, just so you know.
Azalea, I can hear you. Can you please mute?
So sorry.
That's okay. You're cool. So what can be composted? Anything that was once alive. We talked about that. We talked about the fact that most municipal programs target grass clippings and leaves. Grass clippings and leaves are a beautiful combination, and most of the time they heat right up and become a great compost substrate. That substrate can then be used to consume things like food scraps. I've actually used it to consume carcasses of seals. So as long as you have a hot mix, most anything can be added that will compost even better. Where we run into trouble are people that try to use food scraps and leaves. When you mix those two together, you get a wet, stinky mess because the leaves do not have any structure and by themselves have no energy. But when mixed with grass and turned and started, now you've got a hot active pile. When you add your food scraps, the first thing that happens is that all that liquid nutrient gets used up by the microbes and your pile thrives and temperatures go up. And we did learn from the previous class that a thermometer is measuring the pile temperature, but more specifically, the amount of microbial activity, because the pile acts like a big insulated blanket. And so the more microbes you have working, the more metabolism, the more heat generated. And that's how we know a pile is happy, when we have temperatures of 130, 140, 150. So that's all good stuff. And then the other thing we learned is that more and more communities are targeting food scraps and starting to realize that they've already got a compost operation at their transfer station. Can we add food scraps to that? And the answer is yes, provided that you don't do more than 5 yards a month. That's the current exemption that the department has. So a feedstock, it is a raw material used in the compost process. It can be food scraps, it can be leaves, it can be anything, but it is limited to organic materials. We want things that are actually compost. Now, do we put inorganic things in our compost? On occasion, we will, but we usually put it at the end. Like stone dust can be added to a final compost to make it a little bit better. Sand can be added to a final compost to make a topsoil. So, but in the initial process, it should all be organic material. So not all feedstock sources are created equal. I mean, wood chips, shavings, paper, all on paper, not to make a pun there, have the same carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is roughly 300 to 400 to 1. But they all differ in texture and particle size and pile performance. For example, I can put a 2x4 in a compost pile and it'll do diddly squat. But I put it through a machine and grind it into shavings. Now it's going to compost. So the texture is really important. So one of the things that we stress, especially like when Mark Hedrick and I go out in the field to deal with poultry mortality, we want to see what the feedstocks are, because not just getting a report on paper, you need to touch it in your hands, and that helps us determine how it's actually going to work in the compost pile. So that's really important. So sawdust, and then there's a huge variation. Like you can go to 3 or 4 different mills and ask for shavings, and they'll all be different. So you've got to really get to know that stuff by getting on site and looking at it. So, but I will talk about later, you also need to review the lab sheets on all the material you compost to help develop your recipe, which we'll talk about near the end here. And then the other thing is you want to be aware of non-compostables. There are a lot of transfer stations that have leaves and they have grass clippings that look very attractive until you realize that the grass clippings are from lawns that were sprayed with herbicides. So you really need to know the provenance of every feedstock you're dealing with to make sure it doesn't contain contaminants. Leaves have trash. So you want to make sure that the leaves that you deal with don't have a lot of trash in them. So it's just really eyes on is super important. So we talked a little bit about carbon to nitrogen ratio in the biology talk. I talked a little bit about it in the review, but it is basically the measure of the total amount of carbon to the total amount of nitrogen in a compost recipe. And as we have said, the balance needs to be between 20 and 30 to 1. And the reason why is because at that level, science has proven that the compost pile will start and operate optimally as long as you have that proper balance. If the seed-end ratio is too low, you're going to go immediately to anaerobic. It's going to be wetter, it's going to be denser, it's going to be anaerobic, and you're going to have a lot of volatile organic acids being produced. If it's too high, in most cases, it'll also be too dry, and you're going to have virtually no compost activity whatsoever. However, all these things can be fixed If the seed end ratio is too low, you add some more carbon. The seed end ratio is too high, you add some more nitrogen. So there's nothing that you're ever going to find in the compost world that can't be fixed. And that's why the last class we'll talk about how to deal with all these different problems. But composting is bulletproof as long as you follow just general rules. So the brown materials tend to be the carbon sources. Their seed end ratio is above 15 to 1. We have found that when your seed end ratio is below 15 to 1, the material tends to be putrescible, meaning that it'll break down rapidly, sort of like rotting. And when it does that, it does so anaerobically, and it'll be very stinky. So that's why when we're dealing with something really wet, we want to hit it with something really dry. And usually the really dry stuff is the good carbon sources. Drier, bulkier, low odor potential. It's often best used for odor control. As I said in the biology class, that odor is 90% in the moisture of the material. And if you hit it with a dry amendment immediately upon receipt, it's going to take away that odor potential. So you can actually attack odors the first day you receive the material just by covering it with some good carbon, putting it on a bed of good carbon, and sucking up all that moisture. So leaves, one of the most readily abundant feedstocks out there. They do have a nice seed end ratio. It's roughly around 35, 40 to 1. However, if it comes in bags, you really ought to open all the bags and inspect them, because people, even if they're well-meaning, when they rake their leaves, there's a pack of cigarettes or whatever, a bunch of them will just rake that all in and say, they'll take care of it at the transfer station. Well, if your program is relying upon clean stuff, that can be a real kink. The way we fix that is we provide education at the very beginning, and we keep stressing the cleaner the stream, the greater our program, the longer it's going to last to give you a benefit. So everything's about education. The other thing is that they do have other potential contaminants. They can pick up herbicides. They might have dog and cat poop in them. I really strongly stress you can compost dog and cat poop. It should be done separately, but you can put them in a compost bin, and then that material should be spread where people aren't going to walk barefoot because of the potential for tapeworms in the dog and cat poop. The other problem with leaves by themselves as a carbon source is when they get wet, they flatten out and become paper mache. And that's definitely not something that we want to see. Other things, as I said, this wood milling products, things like that, the seed end ratio is pretty high. The texture can be coarse to fine. Anything from wood chips, shavings to sawdust. Now I will say one thing. Wood chips, even if they're like 2-3 inches, they're pretty coarse, they still have a value. If you're building a static pile where you're mixing your leaves and your grass and your food, and you want to have something that gives it a little extra oomph, you can make a bed of wood chips and then place the compost on top of that. And what the wood chip bed does is it allows airflow underneath the pile, and that actually helps to speed up the compost operation. So wood chips do have a value. This material right here, it is a significant component of the waste stream. It has poor structure, and just like leaves, it's terrible. But the other thing is that a lot of this has contaminants such as PFAS and some heavy metals. Now, we go both ways on this because we're trying to stay away from any potential contaminants in our campaign for composting food scraps. However, if this is added as a small percentage, this and ground cardboard, stuff like that, you actually can have a decent compost. It's just, if you know there are contaminants in the paper product, you should definitely just keep it out. And the way you can tell that is by talking to the manufacturer of these items that you get and say, do you have any PFAS as part of the process? So just an extra step, but we're not promoting this in our campaign. But if you happen to have an abundance of it, a small amount added to an already thriving pile will not be a bad thing. So just places you can go, as I said, leaves, every town has leaves. Some suck them up in sucker trucks, which can be awesome. Some actually have a grinder that shreds them as it does it. The problem though with the sucker trucks is that they also pick up a lot of sand, and sand has not a lot of energy. And if you get a lot of sand in your compost, it can actually kill the activity. So you want to make sure that when you see the leaves, you check them and you lift them and you go through them and feel if they're really gritty. That means they got a lot of sand, and so you want to be careful there. Same with wood shavings. There are a lot of places that do softwood. Softwood is a decent, like pine shavings are decent, but oak kiln dried are even better because they have a moisture content of 8%, whereas softwood might be as high as 20-25. So if you can count on less moisture from your carbon source, then when you do your seed to end ratio, it's a lot easier. And then my favorite, of course, are farmers. Farmers have some of the coolest stuff there. Some farmers produce waste feed, which is either haylage or silage. Haylage is chopped hay that's put in a bunker and allowed to ferment. And that fermentation makes it very attractive to animals. And then they feed on it. And dairy cows, it really helps their milk production. But they often have a lot of it left over. Now, waste feed can be spread on their fields. So a lot of farmers, that's what they do. However, we have found that when you take horse bedding, 3 parts horse bedding, you mix it with 1 part waste feed, we get what we call jet fuel, which is a super hot compost material. Then when you add your food scraps to it, it just goes crazy. So those are the kind of mixtures you hope for. Chicken manure used to be a really big deal in Maine, but our biggest facility is now moved out of state. So the chicken manure you get now is from smaller operations. If it's free range, you're not going to see a lot of it. There is a additive called Cheap Cheap that you can buy. It's pelletized chicken manure. It's somewhat expensive, but added to a backyard compost bin, it'll add a little oomph to it and help it get going. But horse bedding is my favorite. In the compost school, I mention it so much that people are sick of hearing about it. But horse bedding is an awesome compost amendment. Down east, we actually have a material called mouse bedding, which comes from Jackson Laboratory, which is a large mouse rearing facility. They send mice all over the world for all kinds of experimentation. But on the rearing side, before they do any of the experiments, they have a kiln dried sawdust shavings that the mice pee and poop on, has a little bit of feed in it, and then that goes to a squeezer that squeezes out the bulk of the urine, and you end up with a really hot active material, which right now is helping Hancock County compost operations thrive. And then finally, bedded pack is a new kind of idea, but it's where dairy cows are placed on a material like sawdust shavings, things like that. They're allowed to lay on it, poop on it, pee on it, whatever they want to do. Then you go through with a rototiller and you fluff it up. You keep doing it, and it creates a hot, energetic material that has the same abilities as horse bedding. So pretty cool stuff. All right, now we talk about green materials. So brown are the dry carbon materials. Green tend to be the wetter nitrogen materials. We say brown and green because that's how a lot of people learned about it in school. You grew up that this, 2 parts brown to 1 part green is your compost. And so we try to use the words that people know, but they tend to be wetter. They have a higher bulk density, which we'll describe bulk density in a few slides here. But bulk density is the pounds per cubic yard. So the higher the bulk density, the heavier it is. And so these tend to be heavy, wet material. They are usually highly digestible because their seed-end ratio is less than 15-1. For example, shrimp residue from shrimp processing has a seed-end ratio of 5. And it breaks down very quickly and very smelly. It's extremely smelly. And then they have tons and tons of plant nutrients, mostly nitrogen, which is a huge, huge percentage. So fresh grass clippings and garden residues still contain chlorophyll. So this is the only residual, hay and grass and of that family, that can be both a carbon source and a nitrogen source. What I mean by that is that it's a carbon source. If you let it sit on the field after you mow for 3 to 4 days, it'll change from bright green to dark brown because all the nitrogen is lost as that chlorophyll volatilizes away, and you end up with a carbon source. If you use it right away and mix it with fresh leaves or even with old grass clippings, you're going to start to see the pile heat up because now you're getting the benefit of the nitrogen source, which is quickly released. If you let it sit in a pile, and this is one of the rules we have in the state of Maine DEP, is if you do a permit by rule, which is what you guys will be eligible to help set up if you get certified in this class. If you do a permit by rule, the only thing that we talk about with grass clippings is they have to be incorporated within 48 to 72 hours at the latest. That way they don't ferment, but they get mixed with dry material and they can start a compost activity. Because what you see on the right is a very wet material, and that stinks. And it will, when it ferments, it'll really get super smelly. So we want to make sure that that material is incorporated so you don't have an odor problem. Food scraps, they are being targeted more and more. As you all know, I talked about this in the biology class. We passed, last year, the legislature passed LD 1065, which as of July 1st, 2030, any facility generating 2 tons or more a week will have to divert their food scraps to the nearest facility that can process them if located within 20 miles of the facility. If they don't have that, then they have the ability to try and donate the food or use the hierarchy to not produce as much, donate it to people, donate to animals, or do some composting operations of their own in order to satisfy the rule. Then that law in 2032 drops down to a ton a week. And then after that, we have the right as the department, as we navigate things, to lower it even lower. But there's no discussion about that happening. Right now, the 2 standards are 2 tons a week or 1 ton a week over the 4 years of implementation. But they tend to compost well with the bedded animal manures. Any hot compost pile, when you add food scraps, they break right down. My favorite example is University of Maine at Farmington. I graduated from there in 1986, a long time ago. But we compost food scraps from the cafeteria with bedded horse manure from the Farmington racetrack. And we generate an awesome compost that we sell 3 times a year for $30 a cubic yard. And we sell out usually within the first hour and a half of the compost operation. So it really does create an attractive, awesome compost. But the one thing that I want to stress is, depending upon the material, if it's all produce and vegetable scraps and things, it's not going to be a high nitrogen. On the other hand, if it's all lobster shells and shrimp and so on, you will have a high nitrogen. So when people say that food scraps are high in nitrogen, you really got to qualify that by saying what exactly is the composition, because that can trick you into thinking that, oh, I got high nitrogen and I can mix it with sawdust, I'm good to go. If you do that, and many have tried that, you'll go back in a year, and when you break into the pile, it'll smell like pickles, because that material will actually ferment inside that sawdust. It'll be almost like an insulated fermentator, and it'll ferment inside, and you will smell pickles because it'll produce all this acetic acid that smells just like vinegar. So that's why you just want to be careful. We don't deal with this anymore, but I wanted to put it up because there are still some facilities in Maine that are composting biosolids. We all know that there was a law passed in 2022 that banned all land application of biosolids. But there are several facilities in Maine that still compost biosolids and then send that compost to places like Juniper Ridge landfill, where it's added as a bulker. So you can mix it with wetter material and it makes it stackable, so it can be put in the landfill and not cause a lot of leachate. So high moisture content, high nitrogen content was produced up to 150,000 tons a year, cubic yards a year of material. But now it's dwindled only because of the PFAS issues. Animal manures, they are balanced by themselves. Goat manure, horse manure, bedded cow manure, you name it. any of those manures in a pile with shavings that they use to bed them will already start heating up. And that's the stuff we target when we're dealing with mortality management, because we want those mortalities to break down as quickly as possible, because while they're rotting, they're attractive to animals. And if they happen to have a certain disease, the animals, the scavengers, can spread that disease. So we want a hot pile that'll take care of it. These guys are super high in nitrogen. These are the ones that have a C/N ratio below 8. So you're going to see shrimp, you're going to see fish, you're going to see lobster, you're going to see crabs. Where you want to kind of draw the line a little bit is if someone says, I got a ton of mussels, I got a ton of clams, I got a ton of this and that have shells. Well, they will compost, and they're a really great thing. But depending upon the size, if they're not crushed first, what happens is that when you put them in the compost pile, the shells will actually collapse around the meat, and the carbon doesn't get a chance to touch it. So the microbes can't make the connection. And as a result, you'll actually get rotting inside those shell fragments. So one of the ways we dealt with this, we have a farm in Pittston, Maine called Webb Family Farm. And many years ago, they actually took in ground mussel shells from Great Eastern Mussel, and they mixed it with shavings. And they found that the piles were really stinky. Well, what we found was that if we added chicken manure, raw, wet chicken manure, to the shells and mixed it up first, what happened was that the manure spread those shelf pieces apart. And then when blended with the shavings, they were able to take off and actually compost well. So it's just understanding that the shells are inorganic. They're really pretty in the finished compost, but they're just not going to give you what you're hoping for. So definitely something to think about. So characteristic wise, the moisture, as I said in the biology class, is where the microbes live, and the nutrients dissolved and available in the water. That's how the microbes actually send out enzymes, kind of digest pieces and suck the juice back in. Without the moisture, they cannot feed. Therefore, the pile that's really dry doesn't really have a lot of activity. You need around 55%, 50 to 65% in the pile. We've seen as low as 40, but we want around 55% for optimal conditions. As I talked about earlier, too high, you're not going to have enough airflow and go anaerobic, and too low, you're just not going to have any activity. So this is the one that I think is super important to understand. This is the bulk density. This is the weight of the material in pounds given a volume of 1 cubic yard. And it can drastically impact your aeration. So we want between 800 and 1,000 pounds per cubic yard. So the only way to tell that is to actually take a sample. We usually take about a 1 gallon Ziploc bag full. We send it to the University of Maine Soil Testing Laboratory. There are many fine laboratories. Penn State has one. Woods End Research Laboratories has one. They're all over the state. I can't make recommendations. This is the one I use, but I'm not recommending it over any other. But their test is roughly $45. And what it does is they take a small amount of material and they put it in a container and compact it. And that helps them determine what the bulk density is. The particle size is super important. If you send them something that, is a ginormous particle size, the little crucible they use is tiny. So it needs to be broken down before they can actually get an accurate reading. But if the bulk density is less than 800 pounds, it means the material is really fluffy, and the first gust of wind will dry it right out and cool the pile down. So we want between 800 and 1,000, because we know that's going to hold the moisture, allow the airflow, and give an optimal structure to the pile. So anything less is going to be fluffy, but it's just not going to hold moisture. Anything more is going to be so wet that moisture won't get through the compost pile. So that's why we like that bulk density. And really, honestly, we mix high and low bulk densities all the time. We take like fish residue, let's say fish curry, and we mix it with bedded horse manure, which is a lot lighter and fluffier. And we mix it and mix it and mix it till we get the right optimal mixture. So that can definitely be done. Volatile solids. Volatile solids are the remaining particle or the particles in the compost mix that are eligible to be composted. This test is measured on a dry weight basis because what they do is they take whatever you're testing and they put it in an oven and they dry it down to where all the moisture is gone, where it's like 98% solid. Then they light it on fire, and it's called a loss of ignition test. And what happens is that once they light it, all the good stuff burns off, and they measure the weight before, they measure the weight after, and that tells you how many volatile solids were in it on a dry weight basis. And we need at least 40% volatile solids on a dry weight basis. So that is the only standard that we require that you actually measure on dry weight. Everything else will always be as is. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So texture, particle size, I alluded to that in the biology class. I alluded to it at the very beginning. It does not hurt to be redundant. I love to be redundant. The scale ranges from fine to coarse. Fine would be like baby powder, and coarse would be a handful of really big wood chips. We like to have a mixture of coarse and fine. The coarse is what gives the pile the structure. The fine is what provides the fragments of food for the microbes and absorbs moisture. So you need the fine for the moisture absorption, the odor control, and feeding the microbes, and the coarse for the pile structure, and to allow air to flow through for porosity, which is the ability for air to penetrate the pile. Fine materials, as I said, feeding surfaces, and so you want a mixture of both. So here you go. On the upper left, this stuff right here is awesome for absorbing moisture. It's going to suck it right up. However, it is not going to let air flow when it's wet. So this is bad stuff. This over here is going to make a pile 40 feet tall, but it is not going to absorb liquid whatsoever. So you're not going to have very hot composting. This material down at the bottom is a mixture of coarse and fine, and it is going to be ideal because it's going to absorb liquid, but it's also going to maintain pile structure and allow airflow. And that's the ideal mix that you want. So ammonia. Ammonia is a very important part of this whole situation. When we do the full class, we go through a whole thing on the nitrogen cycle. But what you need to know is that there are two things that are, well, there are three that are plant available. You have ammonium, which is a salt, but ammonium will rapidly drop down. If a hydrogen ion is taken away, it drops down to become ammonia. Now, ammonia is also plant available, and in solution, it tends to stay there. However, if the pH goes up, then ammonia can actually be lost from the pile. If the pile loses moisture, that ammonia is no longer held onto, and it can be lost from the pile. Now, ammonia is a very funny kind of gas because when we're standing there and you smell ammonia from the pile, it'll knock your socks off. You step back 3 feet and you can't smell anything. And the reason why is because ammonia dissipates rapidly. So, but when you lose ammonia, you're losing nitrogen. And that means that the nitrogen value that you hope to have in your finished compost, even if it's only 0.5%, if you lose the ammonia, you lose that as well. So that's another problem that we try to maintain by making sure we have the right moisture content. The other thing is you can turn the pile too often. And if you do, every time you turn it, you lose ammonia. So what you hope to do is turn the pile as it needs to be turned, but let it stay unturned to keep absorbing that moisture into the particles by the microbial activity. So really important. It is toxic to plants if the compost is used before it's stabilized. So that's why when I showed you in the biology class, I talked about the period of curing after the active phase. It can be anywhere from 3 to 6 months. The reason why you want to cure longer for material that you hope to have a higher use for is because you want to make sure all the ammonia has been taken care of. Because the ammonia itself can be very toxic to seedlings. And if you sell it to a greenhouse and they put it in seedlings, it can wipe out their production for the year. And then that becomes a litigious situation, which you don't want to be involved in. So definitely want to use it after it's been stabilized. And the compost process converts ammonia to ammonium, which is a salt. And that's why you hope that you go to ammonium, because then it's more plant available. And then it breaks it down to where the plants can use all the various components. So very good stuff. So nutrients. The major nutrients in a fertilizer are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium with a K. Okay. And we find that in most composts, unless you're trying to do something to save it, we see about 0.5% to maybe 0.75% of nitrogen, which is fine because it's not a fertilizer. It is a soil amendment. We have a facility in Maine called Living Acres, run by Tony Ramsey here in New Sharon. I'm actually in New Sharon right now talking to you. He makes a compost with a guaranteed analysis of 2% nitrogen. And the way that he does that is during the compost process, he adds elemental sulfur, which is an acidifier. And what it does is by adding the acidifier sort of over the compost pile, it prevents the loss of nitrogen through ammonia gas, because the ammonia then gets hit with the acidifier, adding another H, and it becomes ammonium. So he's able to actually save the loss by adding this acid material to his compost pile. He's the only guy in Maine that does it, but he's also the only guy in Maine that has a guaranteed analysis on his compost bag. So just something really important to consider. So other valuable nutrients. So it's got a ton of micronutrients like calcium. If you do seafood, shells, there's a thing called chitin, which lobster, shrimp, and other shelled marine animals make a really great addition to your soil. It's like a protein that enhances soil microbial activity. You'll see an iron, boron, zinc. So lots and lots of things that are essential to soil and plant life processes. So it does definitely benefit soils in a really positive way. But the most important thing to remember when you make compost is the quality of your product dictates its use. I've had compost come out after 42 days and go right into crop growth. Totally fine. Corn and grass can withstand any heavy salts or any activity of the compost, but not a greenhouse. So sell it for what you think the value is, but be honest with yourself. If you produce a compost that's not awesome, but it's great nutrient source, sell it as such. Just don't, expect the big bucks like someone would for a well-cured material. pH. People ask about this all the time. My pH is 8.2. Is that a bad thing? It really is an indication of the hydrogen ion content of the material. If it's a low pH material, it's definitely going to be a smellier material because it's going to produce a lot of volatile organic acids. If it's a high pH material, you're going to find that it's probably not going to have a lot of ammonia, because when your pH is above 8.5, you start losing tons and tons of ammonia. So therefore, it affects the quality of your final product. And also, it's going to halt activity because it's kind of a high pH environment is hostile to the microbial activity. But really, truly, honestly, in the end, no matter where you start, the compost pile will buffer itself and be somewhere around 7.2 to 8.2 when you're finished. So it's not a value we worry a lot about unless we're starting out with a really, really either an acidic or a basic material and we want to adjust it. The one example I can think of is apple pumice comes off the cider mill. That material has a pH of around 4.5 to 5.2. So it's already got a problem to start with. We mix it with horse bedding, and we can there is enough buffering in horse bedding that it will be okay. But sometimes we also want to add an extra qualifier just in case, and we'll mix in wood ash. Wood ash just a little bit, like as my colleague Mark Hutchinson used to say, just enough to sprinkle on your potatoes. Same thing, just enough to make that adjustment. A little bit goes a long ways. So as I said, if you want to increase your pH, you can use waste agricultural lime, cement, kiln dust, and wood ash are all really good additives. If you want to decrease pH, the two things out there are elemental sulfur and triple phosphate or superphosphate. However, if you're shooting for the organic standard, you can't use triple phosphate because it's been banned by the organic protocol. Now it has to only be elemental sulfur. In the final product, one of the most important things knowing is the salinity, because the salinity of a compost, when added to the soil, salt follows water. When we give, I was a paramedic for 27 years. When we give someone an IV, we give them a saline solution. And part of the reason why is that IV is to help increase their blood volume. But when you add that into their bloodstream, it also pulls water in from around the body, and that actually expands the blood volume. So when you add a high saline compost to the soil, it sucks all the water from the plant roots and they'll shrivel and die. So that's why we want the content to be less than 4 millimos per centimeter in the final product, because it will pull moisture away from the plants. So why not, as you're looking at the feedstock, get that answer at the beginning so you know what you're up against at the end. So that's why we always say on the analysis, pay attention to that. And I'll show you that in a minute. Odors. Putrescibility refers to the ability of the feedstock to rapidly degrade and produce odor. So many odors are simply part of the process. Ammonia is released when the pile is too dry or it's over 8.5. Well, guess what? When you first start, so let's say your recipe is a little bit higher in nitrogen than you want. The first couple of weeks, you're going to produce a ton of ammonia as that pile balances itself. And that's okay early in the process. But later in the process, if you're still producing ammonia, something's wrong. The recipe is out of balance and you need to figure that out quickly. Okay. The VOA is produced when the pile is too wet or the pH is too low. Once again, I would rather start out with a pile that's too wet than one that's too dry, because a pile that's too wet, I can continue to turn and dry it out. A pile that's too dry, I need now to make wet. And the only way to really do that, you can add water, but in most cases it wants to run off the pile unless you have a soaker hose and a ton of patience. What we instead do is we add a wet material to the dry material, like apple pumice. But when I add the apple pumice, which is super wet, I also add acidity. So then I got a balance for that. So it's easier to make your pile wetter to start with and then deal with turning to dry it out. So it's just little tricks of the trade that will help you with. And then you have feedstock odors that persist during the compost. It means you didn't mix it well. If it still smells like manure 4 weeks in, your mix is not good. And once again, the way to fix that is to mix it more. All right, so this is kind of a standard sheet, a compost analysis sheet, and I want to draw your attention to what we're looking for. So this is an example of a material that would be composted, and you see a column that says dry basis, and then you see a column that says as is. So as we go down through, the first thing that I'm looking for is the percent solids or the percent moisture. In this case, it's given as percent solids. It's 49.9. So that's a pretty wet material, right? So I already know that at least half of it is going to be moisture. So that tells me I'm going to need some good carbon to blend in there to dry it out a bit. The next thing I look for is the percent carbon. And I'm still looking on an as-is basis. So it's 12.5%. Okay, so not a super high carbon. And then the nitrogen percent is 0.48. So this actually is a just to let you know, this is a finished compost. And as you can see that it was out in the rain all winter. This is from the town of Cumberland. So it's just a pile of compost that sat and sat and sat. But you can see that it didn't have a high carbon content or high nitrogen content. So then the next thing I look at is the seed-end ratio. If you go down to the bottom, the seed-end ratio is 25.9 to 1. So this is not bad. But what I will tell you is that most compost wants to be around 19 to 1 when it's finished. If you start seeing it creep up above 20, like 25 is not bad. That's pretty usable material. But if it were to get like to 35, 40 to 1, that compost needs more time. It needs more time to break down, longer curing, to get down closer to a more usable number. Because if you add too much carbon to your soil, it's going to pull nitrogen away from the plants, because that carbon wants nitrogen to balance itself out. So we want to be careful there. Volatile solids, You can see that. Let's see right here, volatile solids. That's the one we go on a dry weight basis, right? So if I look at this one, my percent dry weight is 54.7. And remember, I said that we need at least 40. So that material would be it is compostable. Then you got your bulk density. Now that's the pounds per cubic yard. So in a finished product, you like it to be fluffy so that people want to use it. If it's too wet, what people have kind of things that turn them on and turn them off about compost. And one of the things is that if they're using it in their garden and they put it in a 5-gallon pail, if it weighs more than 20 pounds, it's going to be troublesome, especially for the older folks. So when we know that it has a bulk density around 720, a bucket of that is not going to be super heavy. So it's going to be easy to tote around. So these are the kind of little subtle things that you need to jump on top of just to make sure that your clientele don't get turned off by your product. And then the final thing that I look for is the conductivity, which is also called the salinity. It's measured in millimoles per centimeter. And if you look down here, it's 1.9. And as I mentioned earlier, you want it to be less than 4 millimoles per centimeter. So this material would be fine for greenhouse use. Now, the other thing that I'll tell you, that seed-end ratio is a little higher than I like to see, but you got to remember that when you use compost, we recommend that you only use it at a ratio of 25% of the total mix. Anything higher, science has proven that you're wasting it, and B, you're not getting the value you look for. So 20 to 25% of the mix is the sweet spot for compost. And I think, okay, this is the final thing that I'll talk about. And this is kind of cool. This is a study that was done by a graduate student in Ohio State. And what they did is they made compost out of 3 different materials. The one on the top was bedded straw. The one in the middle was sawdust bedded. And then the one on the end was sand bedded. Now, if you take a look at them, the straw one had a really wild response in temperatures. And the sawdust one had a pretty consistently high temperature. And the sand one had really crappy temperatures. Now, let's talk about why that is. The straw was very, very coarse and allowed a lot of airflow. And as a result, it had, whenever there was a really good wind, you had temperatures where it got cooled right off because the wind blew right through it. The one on the right, the sand bedded, the material never got up to snuff because sand has no energy. The microbes had nothing to feed on. And as a result, they just couldn't get it done. The one in the middle here is an ideal scenario. This is a bedded pack. So this is basically sawdust that was laid out. The cows laid on it. They went to the bathroom on it, and then it was turned. And as you can see, it produced a super hot active compost because it had the right amount of material for absorbing the liquids and the dissolved nutrients. And because it was fluffed occasionally, it got up to really good temperature. So this gives you an idea that the materials on paper, the straw and the sawdust have the same seed-end ratio, but in performance, the sawdust does better because of its texture and the way it's worked. So that's why you've got to get to know your feedstocks and work with them carefully. And that's it on the text. I will tell you that there's a lot of excellent reads here. I have included the links for them. The Composting Handbook is a new, very thick Bible on composting. It's available. We give it at the Compost School, but you can buy it from Amazon. It's about $125 or so. You can reach out to me. That's my email address. You can go to our Compost School webpage, www.composting.org. We've got a lot of resources there. Everything's for free. You can take a look. You don't have to come to class. You can just use our site. And then there's a group called Biocycle Connect, which is an awesome journal that's been around for over 60 years. And they cover all kinds of cool stuff. And that is free to join. You just click on that website. And I think that's it. So I will stop my sharing. And
Thanks, Mark. We're going to ask some questions. I got a couple already for you. You ready?
okay, sure.
So someone asked about the cheap product. I tried doing a Google search. It wasn't very clear. That gave me about 100 products, but do you remember where that was purchased at?
Cindy Kirk from Skowhegan actually has used it.
Okay.
I'd have to go look at my email, but she's used it, and it's decent stuff. It's the benefit is that it comes in a bag, or you can get it, I think, in like a 1 ton if you want. But the benefit is that it doesn't start to really break down until it gets wet. So you can work it into the pile and then get it wet, and it'll take right off.
Sure. All right. We have another one. Are you familiar with leaf mold? And if so, just tell us a little bit about it. Good, bad?
Sure. So leaf mold is basically composting starting to happen. It's the initial stages. So that's what occurs in the woods when all the leaves, deciduous leaves fall down. If you go out in the woods and you flip it over, you'll find the leaf mold. So really honestly, aside from earthworms and the arthropods, the bugs, fungi are our best friends when it comes to composting because they break down lignin and cellulose and hemicellulose into smaller particles that then the microbes can feed on. So it's kind of like the first stage of the composting process.
Okay, good. I have one that I kind of developed in my own question. I've got a bag of mulch. I think it's black. It's been sitting there for about 3 years in the bag. Would people want to put that in their compost like underneath in place of chips? Or is it just it's already too far gone, just put it on the ground?
I would not put it under my pile because you really want a very coarse and that mulch as it breaks down, it knits together. And if anything, it's going to be like a pad to put the compost on, but you're not
Okay,
going to get the aerobic benefit of the chips.
gotcha. Other questions? If you don't want to type, you can put your hand up and I'll look for the little hands. There's a hand. Azalea, what do you got?
Hi. First of all, sorry for the disruption earlier. I
Oh,
hope
no
I didn't
problem.
spook anyone. I was wondering, we haven't mentioned like pig waste. Is that something that we typically avoid with composting, or is it a-okay?
No, it's awesome. The thing about pig, oftentimes they add aluminum to it in order to take the odor down. So you want to be careful that you don't have too much of that in your finished compost because it can cause deficiencies in animals if you grow hay with it, things like that. So there's aluminum and there's a couple of other constituents. But yeah, and the other thing about pig, because we worked at it in the prison down in Wyndham, they had a piggery there, and we worked with that in milk. It's really wet, so you got to bulk the heck out of it. So one thing I didn't say that I'll say now is that you can take a really wet material and mix it 50-50 with sawdust shavings, then introduce it into the compost pile as a mix, and you'll get a real huge benefit. So sometimes bulking it up, but if you bulk it up, then you've got to get a new assessment of it so that you have the right numbers. So good
Great. And
question.
then slightly follow up. I know that some people will kind of just feed their pigs whatever they can grab their hands on. Is that something that should be considered when trying to accept pig waste? Is what farmers are willing to feed their pigs?
Well, so that's a great question because I know over the years my department's had some interactions with various pig farmers that threw garbage to their animals. We clearly don't want you doing that, right? We don't want to see plastic and things that are harmful to the animals. I know pigs eat around it, but we don't want to see that stuff. So the idea is that there are certain things you can't under Maine state law you can't feed pigs. So we're our assumption, and maybe sometimes that's a bad thing, is that you're going to follow the state law. So what I'd recommend is that if you have a pig farmer that wants to do it, have them reach out to DACF, maybe talk to Mark Hedrick, and ask, "Here's what I want to compost. Do you have any concerns?" And Mark will run you down a list.
Great. And then my last question is, I know that some people are concerned about like the pesticides that are sprayed on fruits and veggies. Is that kind of negligible once it goes through being consumed and then the composting process, or is there anything on that front that should be avoided?
So the only thing that we currently shy away from is herbicides. So if we know grass has been treated with herbicides, the amount of pesticides that are on a lot of these fruits, the assumption is that everything's clean before it goes to market. So we don't usually get concerned about that. If someone were to test their compost and find out it does have pesticides and they know, then that would be something that we would find out about. And then immediately we would educate everybody else to say, look, be careful of this because of this. But so far, I've not had anybody report pesticides in their compost, but I have had them report herbicides.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So Azalea's question brought up another one I had. What if someone brings you a bunch of milk or some cheese that kind of like went bad? Do you just put that in the pile or trash?
So we normally don't advocate for dairy and things to go into food scrap. However, if it's a fairly good sized facility, you can bulk it. So when I say bulk it, I mean basically if let's say you have a compost management plan through the Department of Agriculture, you're working with a farmer, and that farmer wants to compost, let's say, ice cream from Ben and Jerry's. They get a whole bunch of it. They would put it in their manure pit. They'd mix it with their manure. If it still was really soupy, then they would blend in a bunch of other carbon and come up with a mixture that we then would assess the value. So we know most facilities don't have the ability to do that. And as a result, if you bring in a lot of liquid and you don't have a way of handling it, the minute you dump it out, it goes everywhere. And it becomes a stormwater issue, contamination issue, all kinds of things. So if there's a way to bulk it ahead of time, then I'll give you one more example. We have a facility in down East Maine that composts lobsters, and they get gurry. I mean, it is wet, wet stuff. So they put it in a 30-yard roll-off container. We have them add 6 inches of mouth bedding in the container before it goes to the facility. The facility dumps in the gurry. By the time it gets back to the compost site and is dumped out, it's already pre-amended and most of that moisture has been absorbed in the carbon. So that's take that for what it's worth.
Thanks, Mark. We have another one. If you have a lot of wet brown stuff, like maybe a sawmill or something, wood chips, what are you going to do with all that wet material to get it not too wet in the pile?
Once again, if it's the summertime, I would just put it in a pile and turn it whenever it's really, really hot. We have a compost site in Monmouth, Maine at Highmore Farm that we do our research, and that's where we hold our school. And we'll actually spread it out on the asphalt. And that lets a hot sunny day drives the moisture right out of it. And the other thing that I recommend is if you're going to get into composting large scale, you keep your dry material under cover. Because if it's dry, it's because it has a huge value. If you've spent, let's say, $2,700 for a huge truckload of material, the first thing you want to do is protect it. So either tarp it or put it in a building, because you want the carbon to be as dry as possible.
Thanks. Any other questions? I'm going to share my screen and just show you on where the website listing is for the classes real quick.
And Justin, I have not used biochar. I'm dying to do it because I think that it's going to add an extra value. Because when you put biochar into the compost, it doesn't break down. However, it does pick up a lot of contaminant possibles. And the other nice thing is that when that compost is used, you're sequestering more carbon in the soil. And those large particles don't always hurt the soil texture. So it can actually be a benefit.
Okay, so just for a quick minute, we got the mra.net. That's how you find us. Just scroll down past some of the stuff. Then you'll see our Food Recovery Council. You click on that, and that should bring up brochure, and then you get your food loss generation study, and then keep going. And course 1 biology, you'll see, you just click there, and it'll start up. We'll have number 2 added shortly, etc.
And we are still working on the packet, but if you do decide to become certified, it's going to include, at a minimum, you'll get a thermometer. You'll get a decal that identifies you as a master community composter, a Maine master community composter. We'll give you some educational materials to use and some direction on how to set up your first meeting. And my whole goal is that enough people take the baton and they run with it. and we start seeing more communities develop infrastructure. And myself and Vic and Mark Hedrick, who's on this call, and members of the DEP residuals group, we'll cover the state to make sure that whatever you do is successful. So the whole idea is that what this certification does is gives you the ability to run this program. And if the community you work with decides they want to get a permit by rule for leaf and yard composting, your certificate is enough to cover our technical ability requirement, which is a big deal because most communities have to do a lot to show it. This certificate would be your ticket to get in. And that's what I'm hoping for. And I did get my department to agree that they would do that for the permit by rule. For anything bigger, we still require that you have to have either the Maine Compost School certification or something comparable. So,
Thanks. Got one more question, Mark. I know people are running out of time here, but talk about biochar. Have you used that before? What is it?
Yeah. I just mentioned that. I have not. I'm dying to. One of the reasons why I wanted to use it is we did a bunch of trials of cows and pigs and other animals at a Central Maine dairy farm to get rid of PFAS, and we weren't able to. I've been doing a little bit of reading, and my understanding is that the addition of biochar to the compost might actually hold on to the PFAS compounds. And then what can happen is that if the biochar is coarse enough, when you're done at the end of your study, you can actually screen out the biochar, and the rest of the material would meet the standards for land application. So you're going to basically have biochar and bones in one pile and a compost that does not contain a high amount of PFAS. That's the hypothesis. So I haven't had a chance to test it, but I want to. I think it'll be cool.
Okay, we want to thank everybody for coming today, and the next class will be March 26th. Have a good afternoon. Thanks, Mark.
Take care, everyone. You can reach out anytime with questions.